Hello and welcome to the information session for CTEDD's Educational RFP. I'm Dr. James Wood, the program manager, and I'll go over some of the general stipulations of our process and the specifics of what our documentation requires and the timeline for submitting to the educational RFP. For those of you who've done this for our research RFPs, it's a very similar process, but it's different enough that I wanted to go over some of the ways it's different this year. So as you might imagine, the purpose of this is different from our usual research-centered RFP. Usually once a year, CTEDD funds projects for original research, peer-reviewed research in transportation policy. But this is, as its name says, educational in nature. For this, we want to see proposals focused on education, training, and workforce development. And that can mean any number of things. That could mean funding for workshops in the community or for research and projects with a K-12 audience or university coursework, new textbooks, new curricula. I'll get into more of that in a future slide. But as with our typical RFP, we still keep it open to full-time faculty, research faculty, and postdocs. In order to be a PI, you merely have to be in one of those roles at one of our 5 universities: University of Texas at Arlington, University of South Florida, University of Wisconsin, Cal Poly, and/or Georgia Tech. The main PI is encouraged to be a full-time tenured or tenure-track faculty, but we have seen successful proposals in the past that have been led by a postdoc or untenured faculty. It depends on the strength of the team overall. And proposals should focus on one or more of our educational focus areas. I'll show those on the next slide, and they are illustrated in the document itself. We also have our general goals of equity, community improvement, and student or professional training. So those should be a central part of your proposal. And also an understanding, as we share, of transportation as a core element of communities, trade, health, and human development. So this is not merely projects of an educational nature, but they need to have obviously a strong connection to transportation and issues of equity and community advancement. And most critically for these, we need to see situations, products, and outcomes that are likely to find immediate adoption. And that is to say, you should have a robust connection to your stakeholders, whether that's school districts for younger children or a university department if you're working on new coursework. The connection needs to be there so that you can implement your products immediately after you finish or even while the project is still going. And we'd like you to show that this will sort of hit the ground running and that you'll be able to make change reasonably quickly, as opposed to a traditional research RFP. Once you finish a project, the publishing process for a journal article can take several months, or a book chapter can take a year to be published. We'd like to see things that can touch communities and people right away so that you can actually make change happen very quickly. So our educational focus areas are different from our research focus areas. To start with, we have our first one, which is K-12 education. As you might imagine, that involves the educational needs of school-aged children and their instructors. Example projects under this focus area can research things like a Safe Routes to School program. If you're familiar with that program, it's been applied successfully to some school districts, but not to others. There's also an idea about STEM mentorship for students in this age range interested in careers in STEM. Maybe you can have a project that connects them with professionals in STEM or transportation. Also, items like a transportation day camp that children can attend in the summertime using their school building. Really anything that blends traditional classroom education with a broader awareness of transportation. At this level, you may not see much formal education involved with transportation. It's not part of the social studies curriculum, for example, in most states, but maybe you can design a way to educate this population about transportation. The second focus area is higher education, and those are the educational and career needs of university and technical students and their instructors. Items here might be new course materials. Maybe you'd like to design a new course or revamp an existing course. Improved certifications, like maybe you want to design a transportation certificate or a set of training modules that students can pick up without having to take a full course or series of courses. This might be a funding opportunity to make that happen. The third one is community and workforce development. And that's essentially anyone who's not covered in the first two focus areas, the general public, the transportation workforce, or other adult populations. And these can be things like community workshops for a specific topic. Maybe you live in a state that is building a lot of traffic circles and roundabouts, and members of the public are confused about them or angry about them, and you'd like to do better public engagement, or you'd like to assist your state DOT with educating the public or advocating for certain issues. Perhaps this is an avenue for that, or travel training to teach transit usage to people who have never used it before, career advancement modules for people who work in transportation as mechanics or operators. Maybe there are ways you can improve their career outcomes through modules or online learning. So these three areas, they have a little bit of overlap, and it's certainly okay if your proposal touches on more than one. If you can find a way to inform or educate all three categories, you're welcome to do so. We don't ask that you stick to one. You can stick to whichever works for you. Your proposal submission package, you'll have the proposal document. Actually, as the instruction guides say, it'll be 2 copies of the same document. And that's generally about 20 pages in length, but it's mostly a fill in the blank proposal. So that will help you keep the page limit solid as long as you follow the instructions. There's also an Excel file of the proposal budget, which we need that to be reviewed by your institution, your Office of Grants and Contracts or Sponsored Research, to make sure that the figures line up and everything is allowable as an expense. You'll also need match commitment letters for cash and in-kind match amounts. Any dollar proposed in your budget as match needs to be accounted for with a signed letter from an authority figure, a dean or a department chair. Also, stakeholder commitment letters. Your proposal requires you to list 2 to 5 community stakeholders that you'll be working with on the project. And for educational RFPs, that's especially important. Those may be universities or school districts or nonprofits. Whoever you list on the proposal, you'll need to get a letter from them explaining who they are, that they're aware of your project, that they're willing to work with you. It's a nice documentation that shows your project has connections to the community and has great potential to be realized. The proposal document, it has categories all along these bullet points. You'll see them on the document itself. One important change from previous rounds is that our federal sponsor has asked us to require elements of the COVID-19 pandemic in your methodology section. So even though the COVID pandemic may have resolved in the United States by August or September when your project starts, hopefully, they'd still like you to consider that when you're designing your methodology, as far as if the pandemic resurges or if social distancing requirements become permanent, how will that affect your data gathering or your community outreach? If you're no longer able to have large workshops, or if school districts won't permit you to have in-person assemblies with children, how will you still be able to complete your research objectives in that environment? So if you can have a brief discussion of that in your methodology, that would satisfy these new requirements. But it's otherwise a pretty similar, straightforward process. Each section of the proposal gives a description of what you need to enter. The technology transfer portion, for those of you who have submitted with us before, this is the same process as before. Each campus has a technology transfer assistant director. That's a full-time faculty member on your campus who can assist you in determining where on the technology transfer spectrum your project falls at the start. And essentially it's a 9-step spectrum. I'll show you an illustration soon, but we like to see proposals that are at least at level 3, which is what they call proof of concept. So it's essentially a step or two beyond an imagined idea, something to where your idea has been grounded in the community or grounded in the technology, that you can demonstrate it has potential, it has legs. You also should identify at least 2 stakeholders who are connected to the concept in some way, people or agencies that can help you advance your project. We'd like to see you think about technology transfer. When it first came about, it was originally something at the end of a project to help you commercialize your project outputs or to create patents or licenses. But now we like people to think about this over the full life of their project. Even from the very start, when you're first proposing it, try to keep in mind what the end results will be and how you can shape your research plan to improve upon that, to make your research more of a robust product at the end, or something more useful to the community. So here's the illustration of the 9-step technology readiness level scale used by the US Federal Highway Administration and some other agencies. But as you can see, it's a 9-step spectrum. We rarely see projects of a level 9, level 7, level 8. At that level, the research has been done for the most part, and they're sort of implementing it. Typically, we see projects range from step 3 to step 5 or 6. And that's generally, that's a reasonable place to be for original research, to where you have your proof of concept and now you need funding and support to test it, to validate it in your environment and refine it. So if you can keep these concepts in mind, it certainly helps strengthen your proposal. As I mentioned, you're required to have stakeholders listed. They should not just be listed on a piece of paper. Quite frankly, they should be agencies that you work with over the life of your project, or that you're willing to work with should you be funded. And for an educational RFP, these are going to be your educational actors, things like school districts, your university or your department, transit agencies, nonprofits, whoever you choose to work with. Try to have it be people you can work with from day one, to where you can collaborate on ideas from the start of your project. Don't just look for someone who can receive your finished product at the end, but look for someone who can help refine your ideas before you even start the project. Someone who can be a genuine partner with ideas or funding or sharing resources or data. But try to build a lasting relationship with stakeholders. That's really something we like to see and our federal sponsor likes to see. The budget range for these projects is generally, each project will probably have a budget of between $25,000 and $100,000 that we will fund. So if you can fit your proposal budget in that window, that would be ideal. Generally speaking, if a project proposal is a single PI and a single institution, we would expect its budget to be lower because fewer people are involved. But the larger it is, the more universities are involved, we would expect the budget to be on the larger end of that window. But whatever you have on your budget, be prepared to justify it and be prepared to adjust it if needed. We do have the reminder about staff budgets that when you're allocating funds for salaries, benefits, tuition, reimbursement, we'd like to see at least 50% of your staff expenses devoted to student research. So student wages and benefits, STEM tuition if your university requires it. I know some faculty members may be soft money funded to where they're not able to match internally their time. They need the funding to come directly. In those cases, they can work with us on an individual basis if they need an exemption from this. But generally speaking, we like to see at least 50% or the bulk of your money go toward your student researchers. That's a big goal of CTED and of the federal government, that students get something out of this, not just a salary or a degree, but also that you are training them along the way, that they are developing career skills. So we really want to see robust student involvement. That can sometimes make or break a proposal. If all else is equal, a proposal that has good, strong student involvement generally scores better. On your budget, you'll see a category for travel. That is specifically for research-related travel. If you need to go somewhere to collect data or collaborate with your co-PIs on the other side of the country, that's the place to put the budget for that. That budget is not for conference travel. Conference travel is considered an after expense after you're done with the project. That's a whole separate process. CTED is able to fund some conference travel, but that's a case-by-case basis that's separate from a research expenditure. So please don't put conference travel in your budgets because we just have to take it out. Any budget for equipment, durable equipment, requires a strong justification and ample documentation that it will be used just for the CTED project. It's a very lengthy, complicated process to get approval for durable equipment purchases. If you're purchasing equipment that will be used up in the project or supplies like paper, pencils, what have you, that's fine. That doesn't need justification. But if it's something, a piece of equipment or laboratory machinery that will be around 10 years from now, that's a different story. And that's a different scale of expense. And that's generally not something we're able to fund. If we seek permission for a special permission, that requires a lot of documentation and forms to fill out and about 2 months of waiting. So please try not to put those in your budget. If you absolutely need it and you can't do the project without it, we can try for a special exemption, or we can try to find money with your host university. But generally speaking, if it's more than a few $100s in equipment, that's a very tough sell. So please be thoughtful about that. The budget is required to have a 50% match funding minimum. So for every $2 you request from CTED, you must also provide $1 in match funding from your host university. You can share that across, like if, for example, if you have 2 co-PIs from 2 separate universities, they can offset each other's match. So you don't each have to bring 50%, but as long as the project as a total has 50%, maybe one of you comes from a more substantial university, or you have better access to match funding than the other, you're able to sort of cross-subsidize the other, as long as the project total has a 50% match as a minimum. If you're able to get more, that's certainly encouraged. Also, a lot of people, when they're preparing their budgets, they might not realize that in-kind contributions of data or equipment or things like that, if it can be quantifiable, if it has a dollar value, that can count toward your match. So if someone is sharing a data set with you that has a dollar value, that normally they would charge a commercial client for access to it, but they're letting you have it for free, if you can calculate the dollar value of that and document that, we can find a way to count that toward your match. So you'll want to work with your department budget people and your Office of Grants and Contracts to be sure on the specifics. But generally speaking, try to find your match, certainly at least from your faculty match, the traditional sources, but occasionally you may be able to get cash match from a stakeholder. They may be willing to put up money for your project. And that helps the process. That is not required. As long as it's 50%, that's the required minimum. But anything beyond that might make your project seem a little more robust, a little more attractive to the peer reviewers. So don't be shy. The budget worksheet will look like this. It's an Excel document that's been pre-populated with the relevant formulas. All you have to do is type in the items and dollar figures. I'm happy to help if anyone has any questions with this, but it's hopefully pretty straightforward. And when you work with this, once it's finished, you'll have to work with your grants and contracts people to verify the figures, to make sure, for example, that your fringe benefit rates are appropriately calculated. And at some universities, every student GRA is given a tuition funding. At other universities, they are not. So that's up to your specific campus. But you'll want to make sure that the figures line up and that everything looks as it should on the budget. Your match and stakeholder commitment letters. If you've done externally funded research, you know what these should look like. Any match funding committed in the budget needs to have a letter that matches it dollar for dollar. Your department chair, your dean, they sign letters like this all the time. So the one on the left is for match funding. The one on the right is your stakeholder commitment letter. So anyone you list as a stakeholder in your project, get a letter from them that says they are familiar with you, they're willing to work with you, they're perhaps sharing specific resources or information. The more documentation you have, the stronger your case will be, the stronger your proposal will be. Please do not just list a stakeholder and then not document them. If you say you're working with NASA or Uber or Elon Musk, that sounds nice, but if you don't document it with proof, we can't consider it. So in our funding priorities, we award projects, first of all, on their merit, on the peer review score of the intellectual merit of the project. But we do take some secondary considerations including junior or untenured faculty. We like to see projects that will boost the careers of people getting started. So that's always good to see on the PI team. We love to see projects that prioritize student involvement and training. And you can document that in the proposal itself. We like to see interdisciplinary collaboration or multi-campus collaboration. If your proposal is super technical and maybe it's just in engineering, maybe think about adding someone new, someone from the outside, like a social worker or an education professor, someone who looks at the same problem, but from a different perspective. And that might be an interesting way to strengthen your proposal and make it stand out. So we want it to reach at least level 3 of the technology readiness level, as mentioned before, 3 out of 9, which for many proposals at this stage is easier than it seems. If you can find ways to document underrepresented populations in academia, in CTEDD projects, that helps a little bit. But ultimately, projects that propose innovative solutions to problems of local or national concern. So it shouldn't be a problem that's only faced by your university or your school district, but something that the whole nation can learn from, or the whole world. The bigger the audience, the better. CTEDD has some internal criteria when we receive proposals that we look at. We check to make sure the dollar figures match, that everything is documented and assembled correctly. If you're a past PI with us, if we've given you money in the past, we do look at your performance in terms of quarterly reports and meeting deadlines. Do you do what you say you're going to do? Do you do it on time and on budget? general performance issues. But this is sort of secondary. The main thing we look for when evaluating proposals is external, and this is what comes through the peer review process. It's a double-blind peer review, so they're able to focus solely on your intellectual merit and your applicability of outcomes, your methodology, broader impacts. They don't know your names are removed, but they're able to see some of your general qualifications and backgrounds, the fields you work in, for example. And if you've done a proposal with us before, this should seem familiar. Some important dates to keep in mind. The most important one is the deadline of May 28th. And that's so just around Memorial Day weekend, give or take. And that's when proposals and budgets are due to CTEDD, to the CTEDD email account listed here. That needs to be submitted by your relevant Office of Sponsored Research or Grants and Contracts, whatever you call it at your campus. This is standard practice. They're very familiar with this. Hopefully you're submitting your work through them anyway, but everything has to be cleared through that office to make sure that your match commitment is appropriate and that everything is documented. If it comes directly to us without being vetted by that office, we have to send it back to them, which can slow down your project. So please try not to do that. Try to send it appropriately through the proper channels. And then in the month of June, we will do the review and the peer review process, which hopefully will take about a month. It generally takes no more than 6 weeks. And then by early July, we should be able to announce the winning projects, winning proposals. We'll reach out to those who will receive funding, as well as those who were not selected. We give everybody a full accounting of their peer review scores and what went well and what went poorly. So from the timeline, selected projects should have their documents set up in July and be able to start in August. So we're looking for a timeline of they will start in August or early September and end 12 months later. They can only be 12 months long, unfortunately, because we're coming up on the deadline of the original CTEDD grant next year. So the package should include your proposal document, which the instructions will show you. It's 2 PDFs of the same document. One will have your name and identifying information on the top page. The other will have that removed. But the content of the proposal, your research design, your references, everything else will stay the same. We ask that you send one copy without your identifying information, because we send that to the peer reviewer and they should be double blind and not know who you are. A proposed budget reviewed by your institution to make sure everything matches, your match commitment letters and your stakeholder commitment letters. And the proposal document itself, which is available on our website, has instructions for how to gather all these materials, and it's much more detailed than what you see here. And if you have any questions, of course, reach out to me. I can help you with it. So with all deadlines, obviously, please honor the deadline. If it comes in incomplete or after the deadline, we're not allowed to accept it. We have to reject it. And everything has to include all those appropriate steps I just mentioned. And most critically, has to come through your grants office. And that includes UTA PIs. Some of you are just down the hall from my office. You might be tempted to just hand it to me directly. It has to be vetted by the appropriate office, so please do so. Some frequently asked questions that I can help with. The first one is how to find co-PIs or stakeholders to grow your research ideas. It's a great networking opportunity, especially if you're junior faculty or new to the community. It helps to start within your department, perhaps. Ask if you've been assigned a faculty mentor, start within your department and work outward. If you're working in an area of education with a specific population or subject area, look in your community. There's most likely a nonprofit that works on what you do, whether that's older adults or bicyclists or children or immigrant populations. Whatever the case may be, your community hopefully has some resources to help with that. You can also work with your campus technology transfer representative through CTEDD, and that's a faculty member at your university that we work with on proposal packages. So they're a great resource to help with as well. How far out can you phase your research in terms of number of years? Ordinarily, we can be a little flexible with timelines, but in this case, it has to be 1 year. We make no guarantees of funding beyond 1 year. If your project is in phases, you can do phase one. If you're awarded phase one, there's no guarantee of phase two getting funded. It will have to be a competitive process, same with everybody else. But for this, it'll be a 12-month maximum, which should give you 2 long semesters plus a summer. Next question, how deep into the IRB process should you be? If you're working with human subjects, and this educational RFP, I would imagine many of you will be, you should at least be working on the beginnings of a protocol. It might depend on your specific university, but you at least want to have the documents in hand and maybe have started the process, because as you know, IRB approval, even for an expedited process, it still takes a long time, a lot longer than you might think. So if anything you can do to speed that process up at this point will save you time later on, because again, we have a maximum of 12 months. We have to wind down all projects by August of 2022. So we won't be able to really grant extensions. So please prepare that information as quickly as you can ahead of time. Now, having said that, you may not need to go fully through a protocol with IRB until you've been guaranteed funding. You don't want to waste their time on a project that doesn't end up getting funded. They won't be happy with that. Can you have non-tenured faculty as your lead PI? Yes. There's no provision against that. We've had projects led by postdocs and by assistant professors, junior faculty. It can help to have a co-PI who's maybe more senior and to designate a certain part of the project as their responsibility. It's not required, but it certainly helps to round out your team, to maybe add a senior person in a secondary role who brings a specific task or specific specialty to your project. Are proposals considered from other areas of transportation research, such as econometrics, vehicle safety, emissions? Generally, not on their own. There are university transportation centers like ours that study those specific topics. And if your topic is in that area, feel free to ask them for a grant. But our mission area is equity, policy, decision-making, finance. So any project that we fund has to be tied not just to transportation, but to our focus areas of human factors, economic factors. You can do a study of vehicle safety or emissions if it's connected to issues of equity or human factors. We've seen those projects before, but it has to be tied to the specifics of what we do here. So please be sure that connection is there. Lastly, what kind of budget items are non-allowable? Can we include travel for technology transfer? This is a question that we get a lot with specific items. Generally speaking, as I mentioned before, it's very difficult, if not outright impossible, to get approval for large durable equipment purchases. So computers, laboratory machinery, vehicles, anything that is large and expensive and will last a long time, we are not in the business of funding that with CTEDD funding. Perhaps you can get match funding to pay for that. We also do not generally fund international travel. That's very, very difficult to get. But in most cases, it shouldn't be necessary for projects at this scale. Travel for technology transfer, for example, at the end of your project, if you want to go meet with potential commercial partners or other universities, that's a separate process. Don't include that in your research proposal budget for this project. But if you want money later on after you're finished, just specifically for transportation and travel, we can work with you individually at that point. Other things we don't generally allow, purchases of alcohol or party supplies, firearms, weapons, volatile chemicals, things like that. As you might imagine, it's quite complicated to purchase those. We don't generally work in those areas, so that doesn't come up that often. So when in doubt, if you're not sure about a budget item, you can try to ask me directly or your university's Office of Sponsored Research. Perhaps your department chair might know if it's an unusual item. We try to work in good faith. If it's something that you genuinely need and you cannot work without it, and there's no other alternative, then we can try to go to bat for you. But it generally involves writing a series of letters to people much higher up the chain through our federal sponsor. And that's a lengthy process, a complicated process. So we aren't able to do it unless we absolutely have to. But for simplicity's sake, try to keep your budgets simple and allowable. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out through the CTED email account listed here, or to me directly or our director, Dr. Chisung Pan. There's also our phone number and our CTED website. Again, each of your campuses should have both an executive committee member as well as a technology transfer advisor. And those are both full-time faculty in either your planning or engineering faculties. You may already know them, but I can certainly point you in their direction if you need to know who yours are. They're also listed on the CTED website. So if there's nothing else, remember the deadline is May 28th, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have until then. So thanks for coming.